The morning Elsa Brannock lost everything began like any other November morning in Sutter's Bend, gray, cold, and utterly indifferent to the small catastrophes that remake human lives. She woke in the narrow bed she had shared with Amos for 8 years, her breath visible in the half-light that filtered through the bedroom window, and for one suspended moment in that state between sleep and waking, she did not remember that her husband was dead, that the grief had hardened into a kind of practical desperation, or that today would be the day she would be turned out of the only home she had ever called hers. The cold was already deep in her bones by the time she rose from the quilts, her feet finding the wooden floor, with the muscle memory of 1,000 winter mornings, the planks cold enough to ache through her stockings. Amos had been buried 17 days earlier. She had counted them. The funeral had been sparse. A handful of townspeople gathered at the cemetery gate, the preacher rushing through his words as though eager to return to the warmth of his study, and Amos's brother Harlan standing at the edge of the mourners with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite satisfaction. His heavy black coat buttoned against the wind, his gloved hands holding a black hat against his chest in a gesture that seemed calculated rather than felt. The doctor had said it was the pneumonia that took him, the infection settling in his chest after weeks of a cough that no remedy could loosen. But Elsa knew it was the work. The endless work of breaking the land, of driving stakes into frozen ground, of building something from nothing in a territory that seemed designed to break the will of anyone foolish enough to try. Amos had been strong, the kind of man whose hands could coax crops from stubborn soil and whose back could bend to any labor without complaint. But the land was stronger still, and it had won. She dressed in the dark, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency through the ritual of buttons and laces. The slate-blue cotton prairie dress hung from its peg where she had left it the night before, and she pulled it over her chemise with the automatic movements of someone who had performed this task every single day for years, the wool heavy against her shoulders, the high collar pressing against her throat like a restraint. Her feet found her boots, cracked brown leather that Amos had repaired 3 times, the laces frayed at the ends, and she laced them tight, pulling the knots firm enough to hold through whatever the day might bring. The gold wedding band caught the thin light as she buttoned her dress, and she stopped for a moment, her thumb rubbing across the worn surface of the metal, feeling the smooth band that had rested on her finger since she was 24 years old and had believed, with all the certainty of youth, that marriage meant permanence, safety, a shared future that stretched toward old age and comfort. The kitchen was still dark when she descended the stairs, her hand sliding down the wooden banister that Amos had planed smooth and finished with oil that smelled of lavender and earth. The room held the cold peculiar to kitchens on winter mornings, the chill seeming to emanate from the iron stove itself, which had gone out during the night despite her careful banking of coals. She moved to rebuild the fire, reaching into the firebox for the kindling she had prepared, her hands knowing exactly where everything should be in the darkness, and she was engaged in the small satisfaction of coaxing the flames back to life when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard and the heavy boots on the porch steps. Harlan Brannock did not knock. He walked through the front door as though it belonged to him, which, as he had come to inform her with brutal precision over the past 17 days, it now did. He was a man of the administrative class, not quite a lawyer, but someone who understood the machinery of law and property well enough to weaponize his knowledge against those who did not. His face was red with the cold and something else, something that might have been satisfaction or might have been anger. And he carried with him the smell of tobacco and wet wool, and a kind of aggressive self-importance that filled the small kitchen like a spreading stain. Behind him came two other men, their faces unfamiliar to Elsa. Hired hands, perhaps, or assistants, some kind of witnesses to what was about to transpire. She understood immediately, with a clarity that bypassed thought entirely, that this was the moment she had been dreading since the preacher had finished his hasty prayers over Amos's grave. "Morning, Elsa," Harlan said, and his voice carried the false warmth of a man practicing kindness he does not feel. "Got the paperwork finalized yesterday with the circuit court. Everything's been made official. You got till noon to pack what's yours and vacate the premises." He pulled a document from inside his coat, the paper sealed with an official stamp, and he laid it on the kitchen table without looking at her directly. "You're welcome to take your personal effects, of course. Clothing, any jewelry that's not part of the estate, that sort of thing. But the house, the land, all the improvements, that's mine now, legal and proper." His mouth curled slightly. "Amos never made a will, you understand. Under territorial law, it all comes to the next of kin, and that's me. You never had children, so there's nothing complicated about the succession." Elsa's hands had stopped moving. She was still holding the kindling in one fist, and her other hand was still extended toward the firebox, as though she could will the fire to catch and burn and consume the contents of the document lying so deliberately on her table. She heard her own voice, steady and small, asking him to wait while she finished breakfast, and he laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the low ceiling. "No," he said, "I got a buyer coming out from Helena on tomorrow's stage, and he wants to see the place cleaned out and ready for inventory. You got till noon, Elsa. Noon, that's 6 hours. Make it count." She turned back to the fire and finished laying the kindling. Her fingers shook only slightly as she struck the match, and when the flame caught and spread, she felt a small, cold satisfaction at having completed the task, at having brought fire to the cold hearth, even as she was being cast out of the house that held it. The fire caught properly, climbing toward the wood with eager intensity, and she stood before it, feeling the heat beginning to radiate toward her. And she thought of Amos, who had built this stove himself from a kit that cost $40, and who had taken weeks to get the draft right, and who had stood before it with pride on the first cold morning when the flames climbed clean and the heat had filled the whole kitchen without a trace of smoke. Harlan remained in the kitchen while she gathered her things, standing by the stove with his hands clasped before him, watching her move through the house with the intensity of someone guarding property. She filled a leather satchel with her clothing, 2 changes of the same prairie dress, her undergarments, her spare stockings. She took her hairbrush, a small mirror, the silver thimble that had belonged to her mother, and a bundle of letters that Amos had written to her before they married, when he had been working in Denver and she had been living with her sister in Iowa, writing to her of the land he meant to claim, the life he meant to build. She took her own few books, a Bible, a volume of poetry she had read so many times the spine had cracked, a practical guide to medicinal herbs. She took the tin box from beneath her bed that held the small amount of cash she had gathered over 8 years by selling eggs and butter to the general store, $8.37, which she tied in a handkerchief and tucked into her boot. What she did not take was the shawl. It lay across the back of the kitchen chair, a heavy charcoal gray wool she had knitted herself during the long evenings of the previous winter. The rows of stitches, a meditation of repetition and small mastery. She had intended to leave it behind, but as Harlan watched with arms crossed, she reached for it and draped it across her shoulders, pinning it in place with a brooch that had been Amos's mother's, and something in her face must have registered as stubbornness or refusal, because Harlan simply shook his head and did not object. Perhaps he did not consider a worn shawl worth fighting over. Perhaps there was some small mercy in him, or perhaps it was simply that the shawl could be claimed later if he desired, and he did not feel the need to assert dominance over a piece of knitted wool. The noon sun was pale and sharp when she stepped out of the house and into the yard, and the cold bit at the exposed skin of her face like teeth. The satchel hung heavy from her shoulder, and in her right hand she carried the brass oil lantern, a practical choice, an object she knew she might need, but also something else, some small insistence on taking away a piece of the life she had built, rather than leaving empty-handed. The lantern had hung beside the back door for 8 years, and she had filled it with oil and trimmed its wick most evenings before Amos went out to check on the horses or the state of the fences, and she held it now like a talisman, like a claim on some small portion of the life that was being taken from her. The townspeople watched from a distance. Sutter's Bend was small enough that word of Amos's illness and death had spread through it like wildfire, and word of Harlan's arrival had traveled with equal speed, and word of the eviction had preceded her out of the house by some mysterious mechanism of gossip that required no telegraph, no messenger, only the particular efficiency of a frontier town where everyone's business belonged to everyone, and there was no shame in standing openly and watching someone's dispossession. Some of the townspeople waved, others simply stared. Mrs. Henley, who had been kind during Amos's illness, brought her son to observe the spectacle. The blacksmith stood in the doorway of his shop, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The preacher was not present, and she was grateful for that small mercy. She did not think she could bear his pity or his Christian exhortations to accept God's will with good grace and Christian forbearance. Harlan had not offered her a horse, and she did not ask for one. She began walking, the satchel on her shoulder, the lantern in her hand, the shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and the cold that had been merely discomforting became something else, a presence, a companion, a test. The sky above Sutter's Bend was the color of old pewter, and to the north, beyond the town, the ridge of mountains that formed the edge of the territory rose up like a wall, dark and forbidding, and somehow welcoming to someone who had just been cast into the wilderness of the world without shelter, without plan, without any clear sense of where the next meal would come from, or where she would lay her head when darkness fell. She did not, in those first hours of walking, allow herself to think about tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, or anything beyond the mechanics of placing one foot in front of the other and moving her body away from the town that had watched her be unmade without lifting a finger to stop it. The road north was rutted and hard frozen, and her boots broke through the thin crust of ice that had formed over the deeper mud, and her breath came out in white plumes that dissipated into the cold air. Behind her, Sutter's Bend receded into the landscape, becoming smaller and less real with each step, and ahead of her, the ridge and the mountains, and the vast empty territory that seemed to stretch toward infinity, beckoned with the terrible promise of absolute solitude. By the time she reached the tree line, the scattered stand of ponderosa pines that marked the boundary between the cultivated valley and the wilder terrain of the foothills, the sun had already begun its descent toward the western mountains, and the temperature had dropped enough that she could feel the difference in the air. A sharpening of the cold, a hint of the depth that the winter night might reach. She did not stop. Something in her kept her moving forward, upward, along a path that was barely a path at all, more the suggestion of a trail than any actual delineation, and she climbed with the steady determination of someone who had been broken of illusions and now operated on pure forward momentum. The landscape changed as she climbed. The scattered pines became denser, mixing with aspen and spruce, and the ground beneath her feet shifted from the hard rut of the road to a softer forest floor, thick with needles and small stones and the detritus of previous seasons. The air grew colder, but also fresher, cleaner, free from the particular staleness of the town with its cooking fires and horse manure and the lingering smell of human habitation. She was aware, in some distant part of her mind, that she should be afraid, that a woman alone in the foothills with nightfall approaching and no shelter in sight was supposed to be afraid, but fear seemed like a luxury she could not afford, and instead she felt a kind of numb determination, as though she had already died and was now moving through the world in some spectral form, no longer bound by the ordinary limitations of the flesh. It was the creak that stopped her. She heard it first, the sound of water running over stones, and she followed the sound downhill slightly, pushing through a tangle of brush, and came upon a small ravine, where water ran swift and cold and clear over a bed of smooth stones. She knelt and drank, the water shocking in its coldness, almost painful against her teeth and throat, but it was clean, and it was real, and it was something her body needed, and she drank until her stomach felt full and heavy with cold water. She filled the lamp with water, knowing it was foolish, but unable to stop herself. And when she had satisfied the basic need for water, she continued climbing. The ridge opened before her as though by some deliberate design of the landscape, the trees falling away to reveal a vast vista of folded mountains and valleys, disappearing into the blue haze of distance, and there, set into the side of the ridge like some kind of offering, was the cave. She saw it first as a dark mouth against the pale limestone, and her feet, operating on some instinct she did not consciously access, began moving toward it. The opening was perhaps 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, and the rock around it was smooth from countless years of wind and weather, pale gray limestone streaked with darker bands of mineral deposits. She approached slowly, the lantern held before her, though it was still light enough that she did not need it, and she peered into the darkness. The cave extended back into the ridge, the passage slanting downward slightly, the floor even and relatively free of loose stone and debris. The air that emerged from it was dry and cool but not cold, and it carried the faint smell of earth and minerals and something ancient, something that had waited in darkness for she did not know how long. She moved forward into the cave, her hand trailing along the wall, feeling the texture of the stone, rough in some places, nearly polished, smooth in others, where water had flowed, in some previous time, some previous world. The passage continued deeper, and as her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she could make out the vague shapes of the cavern, the way the walls curved, and the way the ceiling rose in places to a height she could not quite make out. After perhaps 30 feet of passage, the cave opened into a larger chamber. She stopped at the threshold and simply stood, the lantern held high, and looked at what the darkness had been keeping. The chamber was perhaps 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, with a ceiling that soared to a height of maybe 12 feet at its highest point, the stone rough and dramatic, formations hanging like frozen water and rising from the floor in shapes that suggested life, though they were nothing but mineral and geology and deep time. There was a pool of water near the far wall, fed by a trickle from a seam in the stone, and the pool was perfectly clear, reflecting the light from her lantern back to her like a mirror. The floor of the chamber was mostly level, covered in a fine dust that had accumulated over countless years, and when she took a few steps forward, her boots left clear prints in the dust, evidence of her passage, proof that she had been here, that this moment was real. She stood in the chamber for a long time without moving, and something in the quality of the silence and the darkness and the profound stability of the stone began to shift something in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite peace, but some recognition that this place was real, that it was solid, that it would not be taken from her. The walls of the cave did not care about property law or circuits courts or the predations of cruel brothers-in-law, and the stone had been here for longer than the entire territorial administration and would be here long after Harlan Brannock had crumbled to dust, and there was a kind of comfort in that, a kind of infinite perspective that made the immediate pain seem smaller, if not smaller, then at least contextualized within something larger and more eternal. She moved deeper into the chamber, exploring the space with the methodical care of someone taking inventory of a possession. The walls were mostly dry, though there were places where water had clearly seeped through at some point, leaving traces of white mineral deposits that had crystallized over countless years. The far wall, where the small spring emerged, was the dampest part of the chamber, and she avoided that area, instead moving toward the left wall, where the stone was driest and the surface most even. She held the lantern up and examined the space, and she found herself beginning to imagine things, not with the wild fancy of desperation, but with the practical consideration of an engineer or an architect. She imagined where a hearth might be built. She imagined where a roof might need to be fashioned to protect against any seepage. She imagined, almost without meaning to, a life here. Night had fully fallen by the time she settled on a plan. She arranged herself as carefully as she could in a dry corner of the chamber, as far from the spring as possible, but not so far that she felt separated from the water. She spread the shawl on the ground to create a barrier between herself and the stone floor, and she lay down on it, pulling the edges around her like a blanket, and she held the lantern on the ground beside her, not yet extinguishing it, unable to face the absolute darkness that seemed to press against the small sphere of light she had created. The lantern oil would last through the night if she was careful, and she was nothing if not careful, and so she lay in the cave in the dark, surrounded by the smell of stone and the small sound of the spring trickling into its pool, and something in her began to quiet. The exhaustion she had been holding at bay, the exhaustion of the past 17 days and the past 6 hours, and the entire 8 years of being Amos's wife in a hard land, began to settle over her like water, and her eyes closed without her permission, and she slept. She woke in the pre-dawn darkness without remembering having fallen asleep, and the immediate moment of waking carried with it the usual instant of confusion. Where was she? What was she doing in this terrible place? And then memory returned, and she lay still for a moment, assessing her situation with the same methodical practicality with which she had always approached problems. She was alive. She had shelter from the cold. She had water. She had $8.37. She had the clothes on her back and the shawl beneath her, and a brass lantern with enough oil to see her through the first few days if she was careful with it. These were facts, and they could be worked with. She rose stiffly, her body protesting the hard stone floor, and she moved to the spring to drink. The water was clean and cold and tasted of minerals, and she drank her fill and splashed her face and neck, gasping at the cold, and when she had finished her ablutions, she stood in the cave and simply breathed, centering herself, preparing herself for the day ahead. She did not yet know what that day would hold, and she did not allow herself to speculate too far into the future. But she knew that she could not remain idle in the cave. She would die of cold or hunger if she did not act, and so she began to make mental lists of things that needed to be done. She needed firewood. She needed to scout the area for resources. She needed to find a better location for a living space within the cave, somewhere that would be comfortable enough to survive the coming winter. She needed, in short, to build a life where no life had been, and she needed to do it alone and with no help from anyone. The mouth of the cave was pale with coming dawn when she emerged, and the landscape spread before her was frost-covered and still, the air sharp enough to cut. She stood at the threshold and looked back towards Sutter's Bend, which was invisible now, hidden behind the curve of the land. And she felt the weight of the distance that had opened between herself and the life she had lived before. And she found that it was a weight she could bear. She turned north, following the ridge as it climbed toward the high peaks, and she began to search for the resources she would need to survive. The deadwood was abundant. The forest was full of fallen branches and diseased trees that had shed their limbs. And she began the work of gathering, snapping smaller pieces by hand or between her feet and dragging them back toward the cave. It was slow work, and it was physical in a way that working in a house was not, engaging her whole body in a repetitive motion that required strength and persistence. By the time the sun was high enough to cast shadows, she had made 3 trips to the cave, her arms full of wood, her dress smudged with dirt and bark, and she had established a small wood pile just outside the mouth of the cave. She spent the afternoon exploring the area around the cave, widening her knowledge of the resources available to her. She found a stand of pine trees not far from the cave entrance, their needles strong-smelling and full of a kind of resinous vitality. She found a small stand of shrub oak, the leaves already beginning to turn, and beneath them, acorns, though she understood that acorns would require processing to be edible, a future project for when she had more time and more resources. She found the tracks of deer and elk, and she found evidence of a larger predator, a cougar, or perhaps a mountain lion, and she noted the location with appropriate wariness, but not excessive fear. She had lived for 8 years in a territory where the wilderness was never far away, and she understood that danger was a constant feature of the landscape, something to be respected and managed, but not something to hide from. The townspeople discovered her cave on the 3rd day, though discovered was probably too kind a word for what they did. They came up the path in the afternoon, 3 of them, including the blacksmith and the preacher, and a man she did not recognize. They found her pulling water from the spring in a clay pot she had shaped from riverbank mud and left to dry in the sun, and they stood at the entrance to the cave and stared at her with the particular combination of pity and contempt that frontier towns reserved for those who did not fit into the established structures of society. The preacher opened his mouth as though to speak, then closed it again without saying anything, which was perhaps the wisest thing he had done in Elsa's presence to date. "You're living in a cave," the blacksmith said, and it was not a question. "Yes," Elsa said, and she did not elaborate. "You can't live in a cave," the preacher said, finding his voice. It's not proper. A woman alone in such conditions. The town should help you find suitable employment, somewhere you could live with respectable wages." "I'm living in a cave," Elsa repeated, and there was something in her voice that made the preacher step back slightly. She did not say it defensively, and she did not say it with apology. She said it like someone who had already made a decision and had no intention of reconsidering it. "I thank you for your concern, but I am managing." The three men exchanged glances, the kind of glances that pass between people who had tried to be good, who had performed the correct gestures of Christian charity, and who could now report back to the town that they had made the offer and had been refused, and that therefore they were not responsible for what happened next. The blacksmith shifted his weight. "Well," he said, "if you need anything, you know where to find us." They left as they had come, descending back down the path toward Sutter's Bend, and Elsa watched them go with a kind of amused detachment. They had come out of some sense of obligation, and they had offered help out of the same sense of obligation, and they had been relieved when their offer was refused, because now they could tell themselves they had tried, and they did not have to do anything further. This was fine. Elsa preferred it that way. She did not want their help, and she did not want to be the subject of their Christian charity, and she certainly did not want to live in a house in town as someone's hired companion or some widow taken in mending to make her living. If she had to choose between the town's condescension and the cave's honest indifference, the cave was the clear winner. She returned to her work. The wood had to be organized, cut to sizes that would fit in a hearth that did not yet exist. She had found a relatively flat stone down by the creek, and she had dragged it back to the cave, planning to use it as a kind of splitting stone. She used a smaller stone as a hammer and worked with patient repetition, breaking branches into lengths that would be useful, setting aside the smaller pieces for kindling and the larger pieces for the actual fire. Her hands, which had always been competent but never quite strong enough for the heaviest work in a marriage where her husband did the physical laboring, began to toughen and strengthen. She felt new muscles building in her forearms and shoulders, felt her body adapting to the demands she was placing on it. By the end of the first full week, she had gathered enough wood to last through winter if she was careful. She had processed some of the smaller pieces into kindling. She had begun the work of clearing the interior of the cave, sweeping out the accumulated dust and debris of centuries, moving everything to the mouth of the cave, and then disposing of it down the slope. The physical work was consuming, and it was solitary, and it was real in a way that most of the work she had done as a wife had not been. Invisible labor, the endless repetition of cleaning and cooking and mending, work that was performed and then undone and then performed again without end or visible progress. But here in the cave, she could see the results of her labor. The floor was cleaner, the wood was stacked, the space was becoming livable. The word had begun to circulate through Sutter's Bend that Elsa Brannock, that poor widow woman, was living in a cave up on the ridge like some kind of animal, and it became a popular story, the kind of story that people told in the evenings by the stove at the general store, shaking their heads and making comments about what the world was coming to, about how you couldn't expect a woman to manage on her own, about how this was what happened when you didn't have a man to take care of you. The story grew in the telling, acquiring details that Elsa was fairly certain she had never provided. She was eating nothing but raw meat, some said, or only roots and bark, or whatever animals she could trap with her bare hands. She had gone mad from grief, some suggested. She was practicing witchcraft, others hinted. Children were warned to stay away from the ridge, as though Elsa were some kind of danger, rather than simply a woman trying to survive. Elsa did not care. She became aware of the stories only through occasional bits of gossip from the one person who still treated her with a kind of neutral kindness. Mrs. Henley, the blacksmith's wife, who continued to trade with her, accepting eggs in exchange for flour and salt, continuing to do business with her as though she were a normal person and not the subject of elaborate and increasingly fantastic gossip. It was Mrs. Henley who provided the most useful information, along with salt and flour and the occasional thread or needle. And it was Mrs. Henley who told her that the town was laying bets on how long she would last before she came crawling back, begging for the charity that she had so foolishly refused. "Let them bet," Elsa said, and she meant it. She had begun to feel something hardening in her. Not exactly anger, but something close to it. A kind of determination to prove that she could survive on her own terms, that she did not need the town's approval or help or pity. She would make this cave a home. She would provide for herself. She would survive the winter. And then, when spring came, the town would have to reckon with the fact that she had made it through, that she had not needed their charity, or their advice, or their condescension. The second week, she began the work of building the hearth. She had spent several days scouting the creek, learning which stones were best for the purpose. She needed rocks that would not crack when heated, and she had learned enough about stone to understand that the densest rocks would be best, the ones that had been shaped by water and time into smooth, solid masses. The creek bed was full of possibilities, stones in every size and shape, and she began the work of evaluation with the intensity of someone selecting materials for a structure on which their survival depended. She looked for stones that were heavy and close-grained, that had the weight of permanence, that would not shatter or flake when exposed to the dramatic temperature changes that a working hearth would demand. She selected rocks methodically, moving them one at a time, dragging them on a simple sled made from a fallen branch and strips of her underclothing woven into a harness. Some of the stones weighed as much as 20 pounds, and dragging them up the path to the cave required her to use every ounce of strength she possessed, to lean her entire body weight into the effort, to move with the slow persistence of a woman who had decided that every stone that reached the cave was a victory against the world that had tried to erase her. The work was exhausting in a way that left her trembling by the end of each day, but it was also meditative, and it was necessary, and it gave her purpose. She developed a system for the work, leaving the cave early in the morning while the light was still pale, making the journey down to the creek, selecting stones, dragging them back, and then spending the afternoon organizing them by size and quality. By the end of the first week of this labor, she had accumulated enough stones for the basic structure of the hearth, and she had developed calluses on her hands that made even the sharp stones feel manageable against her palms. She chose her location carefully, the left wall of the main chamber, where the stone was driest and where the chimney could be built up and through the cave's natural ventilation, where there was a fissure in the ceiling that would allow the smoke to escape without filling the cave. She spent an entire day preparing the location, sweeping it clean with obsessive precision, using a makeshift broom of bundled twigs to remove every grain of dust and debris, ensuring that the surface was absolutely clear and level before she began her work. She arranged the stones in rough rows, organizing them by size and shape, planning the exact placement of each element, creating a kind of mental map of the structure she intended to build. She had never built a fireplace before. That had been work for Amos and the hired men, but she had watched Amos build this one in the house over the course of several days, standing near enough to observe the process, the way he selected stones and positioned them, the way he tested the mortar to ensure it was the right consistency. She had seen the stonemasons work in the town, and she had observed them with the attention to detail of someone storing knowledge for a future need. She did not yet understand she would have. And she understood the principles well enough, not through formal instruction, but through the patient observation of men who had performed these tasks and had not objected to her quiet presence as she learned. She mixed mortar from river clay and wood ash, laboring over it with a stick until it reached the right consistency, and this process alone consumed 2 full days of work. The clay had to be gathered from the creek bed in small batches, scooped carefully to avoid the mixture becoming contaminated with sand or gravel. It had to be rinsed repeatedly in clean water, the mixture pressed through her fingers to remove any remaining grit, any stone or shell that would weaken the final product. Only then could it be mixed with the ash, which she had gathered obsessively from every fire she had built, saving the residue in a clay pot, adding to it day by day until she had a substantial supply. She worked the mortar with the obsessive attention to detail of someone for whom this task had become not merely practical work, but a form of meditation, a way of channeling her fear and grief and determination into a single productive activity. She mixed it again and again, adding more clay when it seemed too crumbly, adding more ash when it seemed too sticky, working it with her hands when her stick proved insufficient, plunging her arms into the mixture up to her elbows, feeling the cold clay coat her skin, working it until it reached the perfect balance between stickiness and workability, until it felt right beneath her hands, until she could press it between her palms and it would hold its shape perfectly and yet still yield to pressure. The first stone she laid was the most important, the base stone of the hearth, a large flat rock roughly 3 feet square that had been worn smooth by countless years of water flowing over it, the surface almost polished, perfect for serving as the foundation for everything that came after. She positioned it carefully, testing its placement, moving it slightly to ensure it was absolutely level, using smaller stones as wedges to fill any gaps between its underside and the cave floor. She spent 3 hours on this single stone, checking and rechecking its position, running her fingers across the top to ensure it was perfectly even, understanding that any flaw in this foundation would compromise everything that was built upon it. Once the base stone was properly positioned, she began to build upward. She laid stones one upon another, using her mortar to bind them, pressing the clay and ash mixture between each stone with her palms, packing it firmly, ensuring that each gap was filled completely. She worked methodically, selecting each stone for its shape and size, positioning it carefully, checking the alignment of each course, ensuring that the walls rose straight and true and did not lean or twist. The work required absolute precision and a kind of physical strength she had not known she possessed. The stones were heavy, the mortar was physically demanding to work with, and the position required her to bend and reach and lift in ways that quickly exhausted her. It was slow work, so much slower than she would have anticipated. Some days she was able to lay only a few stones before her arms began to tremble with fatigue, and she had to sit down and rest, her muscles burning, her hands throbbing with the strain of the work. But she worked every day, driven by a need she did not fully articulate but understood with complete clarity: the need to survive, the need to have heat when winter truly arrived, the need to prove to herself and to the world that she was capable of doing what needed to be done. She worked in the early morning when the light was best, flooding through the mouth of the cave and illuminating her workspace. And she worked in the afternoon when the sun warmed the interior of the cave just enough to make the work bearable, to keep her fingers flexible enough to work the mortar, to warm her body enough that she could function. The townspeople came by occasionally to observe, standing at the mouth of the cave and watching her work with expressions that suggested they were waiting for some kind of dramatic failure, some moment when the stones would collapse and the whole structure would come crashing down. "You're doing it wrong," one of them, a man named Crawford who fancied himself an engineer, called out. "The mortar won't set proper in this cave. The dampness will ruin everything." But Elsa had positioned the hearth in the driest part of the cave, and she had mixed her mortar with extra ash to help it dry more quickly, and she ignored his commentary and continued her work. 2 weeks into the construction of the hearth, the first freeze came, a deep cold that dropped the temperature far below anything she had yet experienced, a cold that seemed to penetrate the stone of the cave itself and settle into her bones. She wrapped herself in the shawl and the extra layers of clothing she had fashioned from scraps of fabric, and she worked through it, though her fingers grew clumsy and numb, and she cut them on the sharp edges of the stones. The mortar became harder to work with in the cold, and she had to heat water to warm it, and she had to work quickly before it became too stiff to apply. But she did work, and the hearth continued to rise. It was Mrs. Henley who brought her the first real assistance. The merchant's wife appeared at the cave one afternoon with a basket containing a woolen scarf, a new pair of gloves, and a substantial bundle of cloth that turned out to be fragments of a rug that had worn through, donated with a simple explanation. "You need these more than we do." Elsa accepted them with gratitude, and she added the cloth to her collection, and she used the rug fragments to line the small space where she slept, which made that space marginally more comfortable. The hearth rose to nearly 5 feet in height by late November, and Elsa had begun the work of constructing the chimney, a complex arrangement of smaller stones fitted together to create a channel that would draw the smoke upward and out through the natural fissure in the cave's ceiling. This work required absolute precision, and it required her to stack stones high enough that she had to work from a precarious position, balanced on increasingly unstable arrangements of wood and stone. Twice she fell, and both times she picked herself up, checked for broken bones, found none, and returned to the work. It was 3 weeks after she had begun the hearth that she encountered Harlan, and his arrival felt like a violation, like something dark and dangerous entering the space she had painstakingly made safe and productive. He came to the cave alone, riding a horse that looked too fine for the rough path up to the ridge, the animal picking its way carefully through the rocks and debris that littered the approach. She recognized him immediately from the set of his shoulders and the particular aggressiveness with which he rode, the way he sat the horse as though he owned it and everything around it, as though the world was merely an extension of his property and his will. She was balanced perhaps 8 feet up in the air on a wooden platform she had constructed from carefully selected branches, working on the upper reaches of the chimney, her hands coated in mortar, her dress filthy with clay and ash and the accumulated dirt of weeks of labor. She saw him before she climbed down, and every muscle in her body went tense, and she had to consciously force herself to breathe normally, to complete the few final touches on the stone she was working on, to maintain her composure. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, taking his time, clearly performing his own version of authority and control. He approached the mouth of the cave, standing for a moment in the darkness of the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust, and she could see the moment when he spotted her, perched high on her platform, and she watched his expression shift as he attempted to calculate what he was seeing. "Elsa," he called out, and there was something in his voice that suggested he had rehearsed this conversation multiple times. "I came to see how you were doing. Town's been talking about you living up here, and I wanted to make sure you were managing okay. I feel some responsibility, you understand, given that you were married to my brother." She climbed down carefully, holding on to the stonework she had built, and by the time her feet touched the ground, she had arranged her face into an expression of polite disinterest. "I'm managing," she said. "Building a fireplace?" He gestured at the stone structure. "That's ambitious. You know those things require expertise. I wouldn't want to see you hurt, or worse, burn the whole cave down and take yourself with it." "I'm careful," she said. He circled the fireplace, examining it with the intensity of someone looking for evidence of incompetence, and she watched him do it without comment. "It looks functional," he said finally. "You've got more practical sense than I gave you credit for. Still, you shouldn't be doing this alone. It's not proper for a woman, and it's dangerous. If you want, I could have one of my men come up here, help you finish this properly. No charge, call it a gesture of family goodwill." "I don't need help," she said. "Pride," he said, and smiled. "That's what killed your husband, you know. Pride and stubbornness. He wanted to do everything himself, never wanted to ask for help or accept advice. I tried to tell him that there were easier ways, more profitable ways to work the land, but he was determined to do it his own way." He paused. "I inherited that same stubbornness from my father, but I learned to use it more wisely. You're wasting yours up here in a cave like some kind of hermit." "I'm surviving," Elsa said, and something in her voice made him step back slightly. "You're surviving," he repeated, and there was a quality to his voice that suggested he found this amusing. "We'll see how well you survive come February, when the snow gets deep and you run out of food. The town's already taken bets on when you'll show up begging for work. I've got money on February 15th. I think that's generous, actually. I think you'll last until New Year and then come asking for help." She said nothing. She simply looked at him, and after a moment, he seemed to decide that there was nothing more to be gained from the conversation, and he turned and walked back to his horse. He was about to mount when he turned back. "You know," he said, "Amos owed me money, had borrowed against future crop yields, trying to improve the land. When he died, that debt became part of his estate, which became my property. But I'm a generous man, Elsa. I'm willing to forget that debt if you'd come work for me. I need someone to manage my household. Now that I'm a man of property, the pay would be respectable. You'd have a roof over your head and regular meals. It's a fair offer." She understood what he was actually offering. She understood the implications, the expectations that would come with living in his house, and she felt a kind of disgust rise in her throat, burning and immediate. "No," she said. He mounted his horse. "Don't say I didn't offer," he called back, and then he rode away, and she was alone again in the cave, with her stones and her mortar and her slowly rising hearth, and she found that her hands were shaken with something that might have been anger or fear or simply the shock of his presence, and she had to sit down and breathe for a long time before she could trust her body to continue the work. She finished the chimney a week before Christmas, and she finished it in a kind of rage, working from first light to last, pushing her body past exhaustion into some place where the pain became meaningless, and the work was all that existed. The last stone went into place late on a cold December afternoon, and she looked at the structure she had built, a perfect vertical column of carefully fitted stones, bound with clay and ash mortar, rising from her hearth to the fissure in the cave's ceiling, and something inside her broke and reformed, and she sat among the dust and debris of her construction and wept. She wept for Amos, for the life they had planned, for the home they had lost. She wept for the cruelty of the world, which did not care if you were kind or hard-working or good. She wept for the specific injustice of being a woman without resources or powerful family, or anyone who would fight for her. And then, after she had cried until her eyes were burning and her throat was raw, she stood up and wiped her face and went to get wood for the first real fire. The wood she selected was carefully chosen, the driest pieces, the densest wood, the best kindling. She arranged it in the hearth with the ritualistic care of someone performing a ceremony, and she struck her match, and she lit the fire. The smoke rose immediately, moving upward in a perfect column, and she watched with her heart in her throat to see where it would go, and it moved smoothly and cleanly through the chimney structure, rising up and out of the cave without a single wisp entering the chamber. She had built it correctly. The draft was perfect. The smoke drew clean and true, and the heat began to fill the space around her, spreading outward and warm in the stone, warm in the air, warm in her body where she stood in front of it. She fed the fire slowly, adding wood with careful deliberation, monitoring the draft, ensuring that everything continued to work as it was supposed to. The heat built steadily, and within an hour, the entire main chamber of the cave was warm. Not hot, but genuinely warm. The kind of warmth that made her fingers prickle as feeling returned to them. The kind of warmth that made the cave transform from a cold stone shelter into something that approached the status of a home. She sat by the fire as darkness fell, and she watched the flames dance in the hearth, and she felt something like peace settle over her. She had done this. She had taken stone and clay in her own two hands, and she had built something real, something that worked, something that would keep her alive through the long winter that was coming. The town could laugh. Harlan could make his offers and his insinuations. The world could be cruel and unjust and indifferent to her suffering. But here, in the cave, in the space she had carved out for herself, she had created something that belonged entirely to her, and it would not be taken away. Over the next 2 weeks, she refined the system, working out the best way to manage the heat, the proper placement of wood, the delicate balance between having enough fire to maintain warmth and not so much that the wood ran out too quickly. She experimented methodically with the height of the fire, building it higher on some days and lower on others, observing how the heat distribution changed with the shape of the flames. She experimented with the depth of the hearth, adjusting the position of stones at the back to see how they reflected and radiated heat, learning through trial and error which arrangements were most efficient, which would warm the maximum amount of space with the minimum amount of fuel. And as she worked, she began to imagine the next stage of her project, the bread oven, and the idea of it, the possibility of bread, of sustenance made by her own hands, of the smell and taste of it, became almost as important to her survival as the heat itself. She had watched her mother make bread, had made bread herself for 8 years as Amos's wife, understood the process as thoroughly as she understood anything in the world, the rhythm of it, the way the dough needed to be worked, the way the warmth and time transformed the simple mixture of flour and water and salt into something nourishing and good, had been a kind of meditation for her, a daily ritual that gave structure to her days. But a bread oven was a different matter entirely, a more complex construction, a structure that existed at the intersection of architecture and chemistry, and it required a specialized knowledge that she would have to acquire through observation and trial and error, and the willingness to accept failure and learn from it. She spent several days scouting the riverbank for clay of the right quality, learning to judge by touch and feel which clay would work best, which had the right balance of stickiness and structural integrity. She took samples from different locations, learning that clay near the water's edge was often too fine and silty, that clay from further back in the banks, clay that had been exposed to weather and had had time to compress and cure, was firmer and more reliable. She collected samples and brought them to the cave and began to experiment methodically, mixing different clays with water and with plant fiber, dried grass, hair from her brush, anything that would add structural strength, shaping them into small test forms and setting them in the heat near the fire to see how they would cure. Some cracked, some crumbled to dust, some remained whole and structurally sound, and she made note of these successes, adjusting her recipe, refining her technique. The bread oven would be built beside the main hearth, angled slightly so that it would benefit from the radiant heat of the primary fire while remaining structurally independent, existing as a kind of companion to the hearth rather than being dependent on it. She had seen a bread oven once in Denver during the early years of her marriage when Amos had taken her to the city for supplies, had watched a baker work it with the ease of long familiarity, the way he moved around it with the confidence of someone who had spent thousands of hours in its presence. She had stood in the bakery doorway watching the process, and she carried that memory with her now, the visual details preserved so vividly that she could close her eyes and see exactly how the oven had been constructed, the shape of it, the proportions. She needed to build a dome structure, and that was going to require either a substantial form around which to construct it, or an incredibly steady hand and a deep understanding of the physics of arched structures. She considered both options and realized she did not have the materials for the first approach and was not certain she possessed the skill for the second, and so she compromised, creating a hybrid approach that drew on both methods. She solved the fundamental problem by using clay bricks, which she fashioned individually and allowed to dry near the heat of the hearth. Each brick had to be shaped perfectly to a wooden form she created, using a thin piece of wood to define the length and width and height, removing the form only after the brick had cured enough to hold its shape. Each brick had to be exactly the same dimensions as all the others, because the dome would only work if every single brick fit precisely with its neighbors, creating an arch so smooth and regular that the weight of each brick was distributed equally across the entire structure. It was tedious work, repetitive and requiring absolute precision, and it consumed her entire first month in the cave, her hands becoming the most calloused they had ever been, her fingers developing grooves and patterns from the constant handling of clay and wood. By the beginning of January, she had accumulated enough bricks to begin the actual construction of the dome, hundreds of them, arranged by size and quality, a small army of clay bricks that represented weeks of painstaking labor. She had been tempted many times during the creation process to simply give up, to decide that the hearth was enough, that she could survive on the heat it provided without the added complexity of a bread oven. But something in her had refused to accept that limitation, had insisted that she was capable of more, that the challenge was part of what made the work meaningful. She began the process of constructing the dome. She used mortar made from a special clay mixture that she had developed through experimentation, a formula that was slightly different from the mortar she had used on the hearth, containing a higher ratio of ash to give it faster curing time and greater structural strength. She built the brick structure with the careful attention to detail of someone who understood that any mistake, any misalignment of even a single brick, any weakness in the mortar joints would cause the whole structure to collapse catastrophically, destroying weeks of work and quite possibly injuring her in the process. She worked slowly, methodically, checking and rechecking the alignment of each brick as she laid it, using a crude level made from a piece of wood balanced on stones to verify that each course was absolutely true. She placed the bricks in a spiral pattern, starting at the base where the oven would sit, building upward and inward, the dome gradually closing in on itself, the space inside shrinking with each layer she added. The work required her to be in awkward positions, leaning far forward to reach bricks at the back of the dome, stretching her arms overhead to place bricks at the top, the mortar caking on her arms and clothing, her back aching from the repetitive bending and reaching. It took 3 weeks to build the dome itself, 3 weeks of slow, painstaking work that saw her complete some days, feeling as though she had achieved nothing because each individual brick represented only a small increment of progress toward the finished structure. It took another week to construct the entrance tunnel, creating a passageway into the dome that would allow her to insert bread while keeping most of the heat inside, an opening that required its own architectural considerations, its own careful calculations of proportions and strength. It took another 3 days to construct the chimney, a simple shaft of bricks that would allow heat to escape gradually, that would allow the interior of the oven to maintain an even temperature, even after the primary fire was allowed to burn down. And then, on a cold February morning, when the ridge was deep in snow and the wind was howling down from the peaks with a ferocity that made even the interior of the cave feel threatened, a morning when the world outside seemed hostile and frozen and entirely uninviting, she performed the first firing of her bread oven. She had mixed the dough the night before, using flour that she had purchased from Mrs. Henley with money from her egg sales, flour that represented the fruits of her labors in the months before her world had collapsed, salt that had been a gift from the same source, and water from her spring. She had combined these simple elements in a large clay bowl she had fashioned and fired specifically for this purpose, using her hands to work the dough, kneading it with the familiar rhythm that her muscles remembered even after the passage of time since she had last performed this work. The dough had resisted at first, stiff and unwilling, but gradually it had softened under her hands, becoming elastic and supple, developing the gluten structure that would give the bread its crumb and texture. She had shaped it into a single large loaf, perhaps 4 pounds of dough, and she had let it rise slowly through the night, covered with a cloth in the warmest spot of the cave, in the space near the main hearth where the residual heat from the dying fire would gently encourage the yeast to work its slow transformation. Early in the morning, while the new bread oven was still cold, she lit a fire inside it, burning the very finest kindling and the smallest pieces of wood, building the heat slowly and carefully, refusing to rush the process, even though impatience tugged at her. She was bringing the interior temperature up in measured increments, and this was the dangerous time, the moment when all her calculations and theories would be tested against the real behavior of clay and brick and fire. If she raised the temperature too quickly, the bricks might crack, the mortar might fail, the entire structure might crumble. If she didn't get it hot enough, the bread wouldn't cook properly, would remain gummy inside, would fail in the most basic and humiliating way. She monitored the temperature by the simple method of watching how the interior of the oven glowed, starting with a dull red glow and gradually progressing to a brighter, more orange-tinged light as the temperature increased. She relied on experience, on intuition, on the kind of understanding that came from watching her mother work year after year, learning the craft through observation and osmosis and the deep muscle memory of having performed similar tasks. She tended the fire with the attention of someone performing a sacred ritual, adding small pieces of wood at carefully calculated intervals, watching to see how the flames responded, adjusting based on the feedback the fire gave her. It took hours to bring the oven to the proper temperature, but she did not mind the waiting, did not feel frustrated by the slowness of the process. There was something meditative about the waiting, something that allowed her to settle into her body and into the task at hand, something that felt almost like prayer. When the oven was hot enough, and she knew the moment when it reached the right temperature by the quality of the heat, the way the air inside the dome seemed to shimmer and distort, the way the clay itself seemed to be glowing from within. She pushed the fire to the side, using a long iron rod that she had fashioned by carefully bending a willow branch into a hook shape and securing the curve with wrappings of bark, learning through practice to work with it as a tool that extended her reach into the heat. She swept the interior of the oven clean with a bundle of grass, removing every scrap of ash and charred wood, ensuring that the baking surface was clean and ready. And then she took the loaf she had prepared, felt its weight in her hands, felt the way the gluten-developed dough was slightly damp on the surface from the rise, and she slid it into the oven. She worked quickly, closing the entrance with a flat stone that fit nearly perfectly, creating a seal that left just a small gap for the smoke to escape. And she stepped back, and then she waited. The waiting was agony in a way she had not anticipated. She wanted to look inside, to check on the bread, to see if it was cooking properly, to verify that the temperature was correct, and that the bread was not burning or remaining uncooked. But she forced herself to stand still, and she counted her heartbeats, and she waited. The smell began after perhaps 10 minutes, a smell so wonderful, so full of promise and memory, that it made her eyes burn with tears that she could not quite explain. It was the smell of bread baking, of yeast and heat, and the miraculous transformation of flour and water and salt into something transcendent and nourishing. And it smelled like her mother's kitchen in Iowa, where Elsa had learned this craft at her mother's side. It smelled like the first winter of her marriage to Amos, when she had baked bread every morning with pride in the shape of the loaves and the color of the crust, and the way it had come out of the oven, golden and perfect, when the future had seemed assured and unlimited. When she finally removed the bread from the oven, pulling the flat stone aside with shaking hands and reaching in with her iron rod to slide the loaf back out onto a piece of wood. It was dark brown, nearly black on the top, where the intense heat had caramelized the surface and created a crust so hard and glossy that it looked almost varnished. But when she broke it open, careful to avoid burning herself on the steam that rose from the interior, the crumb was perfect, tender and irregular and full of air, the flavor deep and complex with just a hint of salt, the texture exactly as it should be. She ate a slice while it was still hot, the steam rising from the interior and coating her face, the butter that Mrs. Henley had sent soaking into the warm bread, the crumbs slightly sweet and nutty from the slow fermentation of the yeast, and it was the most delicious thing she had eaten in months, possibly in her entire life. And she ate another slice, and then another, standing in the warmth of her cave, surrounded by her own creation, and for the first time since Amos had died, she felt something that might have been happiness. She made 4 loaves over the next week, perfecting her technique, learning the exact moment when the oven was ready, how long each loaf should stay in the heat, how to judge doneness by the color and the sound of the crust. By the 3rd loaf, she had it right, and by the 4th it was nearly perfect. She began to store bread, wrapping it in cloth, stacking it in a cool corner of the cave where it would keep for days, and she felt something like security settle over her. She had heat, she had shelter, she had bread, she had water. she could survive the winter. And more than that, she could do more than merely survive. She could live. The town watched the smoke rise from her cave, watched it curl from her chimney on the bitter cold mornings, and they began to revise their stories. Some said she had sold her soul to the devil in exchange for the ability to build impossible structures. Others suggested she had always been strange, always had a touch of the uncanny about her, and that it was no wonder she could manage something this impressive when normal women couldn't. A very few, began to express something that might have been grudging admiration. The preacher came to the cave in early February and found her kneading bread dough, her hands moving with ancient rhythm, her face flushed from the heat of the oven, and he stood in the entrance watching her work without speaking. And when he finally left, he did so in silence, which was perhaps his way of acknowledging something he could not quite articulate. It was Mrs. Henley, though, who told her the thing that would prove most important. The merchant's wife came to the cave with her weekly delivery of supplies, flour, salt, thread, a jar of honey as a gift, and as she was arranging these items, she mentioned casually that the town was full of rumors about what Elsa was building, and that most of them were variations on the theme of witchcraft or madness, or both. "But I know better," Mrs. Henley said, and she smiled at Elsa with genuine warmth. "I know what you're doing up here. You're building a life, that's all. Just a life. And that's the only magic any of us have." The work of preservation began in earnest as September bled into October, and Elsa moved through her days with the quiet urgency of someone who understands what winter demands. Each morning before the light fully broke, she was already moving through the hills with a canvas satchel and a small, sharp knife, knowing the calendar better than any town dweller who relied on newspapers and almanacs. The berries came first. Wild huckleberries and currants clustered on branches that already showed hints of crimson at the edges of their leaves. She picked them with careful fingers, working slowly so as not to bruise the delicate fruit, filling basket after basket and carrying them back to her cave where she spread them on flat stones, near but not too near the hearth fire, letting the gentle warmth draw out their moisture over days. The process of drying berries taught her patience in a new language. She watched them shrivel from plump jewels into something darker, more concentrated, more essential. Each day she would turn them with a wooden spoon, moving them from the hotter stones to the cooler ones at the cave's periphery, learning the temperament of her hearth as a musician learns an instrument. The huckleberries dried to an almost black hue, their skins wrinkling like the faces of ancient people, while the currants shriveled into tight, concentrated spheres of intense sweetness. Some berries would dry clear and perfect. Others she would crush between her palms and add to a growing jar of mixed berry dust, which she would later use in her bread during the deepest winter months when fresh fruit was only a memory. The dust would stain her fingers deep purple blue, and she learned not to be alarmed by the color, understanding it as the evidence of her work, the physical proof of preparation. But berries were only the beginning. The hills around Sutter's Bend offered abundance to anyone patient enough to know where to look and what to recognize. Elsa had been born to this knowledge. Her mother had taught her years ago, before she married Thomas, and moved away from the homestead where such skills seemed less necessary. Now that knowledge rose up from her hands like muscle memory. She found wild onions and dug them with a flat stone, brushing the dark soil from their papery skins and braiding them together into long chains that she hung from the cave ceiling where the air moved cool and even. The individual bulbs were small, no larger than walnuts, but their flavor was concentrated and sharp. and she estimated that a single braided rope would provide enough onion to flavor months of cooking. She gathered the white roots of a plant her mother had called lady's comb, recognizing them by their lacy green foliage and the way they grew in clusters in the damper areas near streams. The roots were bitter and pale, and when dried they could be steeped into a tea that her mother had sworn would ease fever and inflammation. She dried them in bundles hung from the cave ceiling, where the air circulated constantly, and the pale roots gradually turned the color of old ivory, becoming hard and slightly brittle. She tested them occasionally by attempting to break one with her fingers, and when they snapped cleanly rather than bending, she knew they were properly preserved. She collected the seed heads of wild caraway before they could drop to the earth, working through the fields in the cooling evenings when the air was still, and the light took on the golden-orange hue that came in early autumn. The seeds were tiny and fragrant, and she spread them to dry on cloth laid across the stone floor of the cave, creating strange geometric patterns that caught the light like arrangements of tiny jewels. She would brush her hand across them as she moved through the cave, and the whole space would fill with the warm, slightly peppery aroma that spoke of cooking and flavor and the civilization that good seasoning represents. She found wild mushrooms growing in the shaded areas of the forest, and she learned to identify them with painstaking care. The pale, meaty puffballs that grew near the edges of trees, the delicate chanterelles that appeared after rain, the shelf fungi that grew on dead wood and could be dried and crumbled into a powder that added depth to soups. The work of identification was dangerous. Poison and nourishment could grow side by side, and a single mistake could be catastrophic. She moved slowly through the forest with a basket, studying each specimen carefully before collecting it, and when she had any doubt, she simply left it where it grew. Safety was more important than abundance. The work of gathering filled her hands and her mind simultaneously, pushing out the weight of loneliness that sometimes threatened to settle in her chest during the long afternoons. She moved between the cave and the hillside with purpose, becoming part of the landscape rather than something imposed upon it. The birds grew accustomed to her presence. The deer learned not to startle at her movement. The light changed minute by minute, hour by hour, and she tracked it the way plants tracked the sun, turning her face toward warmth whenever she found herself standing still long enough to feel the temperature of the air on her skin. By early October, the clay crocks that Eudora Platt had helped her fire in the cave furnace began to fill with the evidence of her labor. Elsa had made the crocks herself, hand-rolling the clay she'd found in a stream bed 3 miles down the ridge, shaping them into vessels of varying sizes with a potter's sure touch that surprised her. She had never thought of herself as skilled in such work, but the clay seemed to teach her its own language as her hands shaped and smoothed. The work was meditative, soaking her hands in water, knead in the clay until it was uniform in texture, rolling it into long coils and spiraling them upward to form the basic shape of the vessel. She would shape the rim carefully, smoothing it with a wet thumb so it wouldn't catch rough fabric, and then set the still soft crock aside to harden slightly before attempting to move it. The first firing had been terrifying and triumphant. She had built a careful kiln inside the hearth itself, stacking the crocks and surrounding them with hot coals and ash, feeding the fire with measured precision until the clay had hardened from the red-brown of raw earth into something permanent and strong. She had stayed by the fire all night during that first firing, monitoring the temperature, listening to the subtle crackling of the clay as it transformed from soft earth into ceramic. The smell of heating clay filled the cave, a smell like stone and earth and fire all combined. And when dawn came and she carefully removed the finished crocks, she had felt something like pride at having created objects that were both beautiful and functional, that would serve her through the long winter ahead. Now those crocks lined the shelves she had built against the northern wall of the cave. She had scavenged the timber from the wreckage of an abandoned homestead 5 miles distant, a place where someone had tried and failed, leaving behind the bones of their attempt for someone more stubborn to repurpose. The structure had been slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Trees were growing through what had once been walls, and the roof had largely collapsed. She had surveyed the wreckage carefully, selecting only the straightest pieces of wood that could be carried or dragged down the hillside. She had hauled the wood piece by piece down the slope over the course of a week, working methodically, never rushing, pacing herself so that she didn't exhaust her strength. Back at the cave, she had fashioned the wood into shelves with careful hand tools, a saw she had acquired, an axe, a chisel that she had ground on stone until it held an edge. She had studied the way the wood wanted to split and align, working with its grain rather than against it, understanding that the strongest structures came from cooperation with the material rather than domination of it. She secured the shelves to the stone with leather straps and iron brackets she had salvaged, trusting in the immovable weight of the rock itself. The shelves were sturdy enough to hold weight without flexing, and they were positioned so that they caught the light from the hearth and the lantern, creating a small island of illumination against the darker stone of the cave's interior. The first shelf held jars of dried herbs, sage and mint and yarrow, each label written in her careful script on pieces of cloth tied around the neck of each crock with twine. She had dried the herbs by hanging them upside down from thin branches suspended across the cave ceiling, and as they dried, the green had faded to subtle shades of gray-green and brown, but the fragrance had intensified into something almost overwhelming. When she brought the dried bundles down from the ceiling and began to strip the leaves from the stems, the dust of dried plant matter had hung in the air like visible memory, filling her nose and mouth with the taste of her own preparation. The second shelf held berries, some whole and some crushed into powder. The third shelf held the preserved vegetables, wild turnips pickled in vinegar that she had made by soaking wild herbs and seeds in the liquid, greens that had been salted and dried, roots bound in cloth and stacked like firewood. Each shelf was an essay in preparation, a meditation on the possibility of abundance, even when the world outside grew cold and sparse. She had organized them roughly by how much she expected to use them, placing the items she would need most frequently, the dried vegetables, the herbs for tea, within easy reach, while the items she might need less often were arranged higher up. The gathering of firewood became its own obsession, its own form of meditation that consumed her afternoons with increasing intensity as October progressed into November. Elsa rose before dawn and worked until the light began to fade, moving through the forest around Sutter's Bend with a hand axe and a small saw, identifying dead wood and fallen branches, preferring the seasoned timber that burned hot and clean over the green wood that hissed and smoked and wasted energy in vaporizing water content. She had calculated, in her careful way, how much wood a hearth the size of hers would require to burn through a Montana winter. She had assumed she would need to maintain a fire nearly constantly, and she had estimated the burn rate based on fires she had observed in the past, thinking about how much wood had been consumed in the stove of Thomas's house during the winters they had lived there together. The answer had been staggering. Cords and cords, an enormous pile of fuel that seemed almost impossible to accumulate by the labor of a single woman. But she had set about answering it with methodical determination, understanding that failure was not an acceptable outcome. If she did not gather enough firewood, she would die. The knowledge was simple and clear, and it drove her forward even on the days when her arms ached and her shoulders screamed from the repetitive work of lifting and carrying. The wood stacking became a choreography of increasing complexity. First, she sorted the pieces, the finger-thin kindling separated from the wrist-thick branches, which were themselves separated from the arm-sized logs. She arranged the kindling in tight bundles using twine and stood them upright where they would not draw moisture from the cave floor. The smaller branches she stacked in careful cross-hatched piles, each piece laid perpendicular to the one below it, creating structures of surprising stability that a child could knock over, but that nevertheless held the logic of good construction. The stacks had a pleasing geometry to them. The interlocking pattern meant that the wood dried evenly, and when she needed to grab a piece, she could simply slide it out from the loose stack without the whole thing collapsing. The largest logs she laid in ranks against the western wall, creating a barrier between the living space and the cold stone, the wood itself becoming insulation as well as fuel. She began stacking them only shoulder high, but as the weeks progressed and her gathering efforts accelerated, she increased the height of the stacks until they reached nearly to the ceiling. By November, the wood filled a significant portion of the cave's western chamber, and still she continued gathering on the clear days when the weather held, and she could move safely through the hills without fear of being caught in an early season storm. The work had become almost meditative. The swing of the axe, the careful selection and carrying of branches, the logic of stacking and arrangement. Her body adapted to the labor. The initial soreness faded after the first few weeks, replaced by a deep familiarity with the work. Her hands grew calloused and strong, the skin hardening into protective layers that no longer blistered. The skin across her shoulders developed new muscle, becoming visibly more defined and powerful. Her back straightened rather than bent under the weight of her labor, as if her body was remembering what it was capable of, what strength looked like when it was actually used for something. She could carry loads now that would have been impossible 2 months ago. Logs that had required both hands and all her strength to move now seemed almost manageable. Her posture changed. She began to carry herself differently, with a confidence that came from repeated success and the knowledge of her own capacity. When she caught her reflection in a pool of water, she barely recognized herself. Her face had been weathered further by the sun and wind. Her hands had become something almost unrecognizable, transformed by work and exposure into something belonging to a laborer rather than the wife of a homesteader. By November, the wood had accumulated to a level that was almost overwhelming. She had gathered and stacked enough timber to fill a small cabin, and still she continued gathering on the clear days when the weather held. The work had become less about reaching an abstract goal and more about the simple satisfaction of continuing, of pushing herself to accumulate more than enough to ensure that even an extended winter or an unexpected period of extreme cold would not catch her unprepared. The cave was transforming in ways that went beyond the physical accumulation of supplies. Where 3 months ago there had been only bare stone and possibility, now there was structure and comfort and the unmistakable sense of a home being built. The hearth radiated warmth into the darkest corners, and the smoke from the clay oven drifted up and out through the stone chimney she had carefully constructed, dissipating into the autumn air with a gentle gray plume that was visible from miles away. The lantern hung from a hook she had driven into a natural crevice in the rock, and at night it cast a golden light across the space that made everything seem both real and dreamlike. The shadows of objects playing across the stone walls in patterns that shifted with the movement of the flame. The entrance of the cave, once a simple aperture in the rock, had begun to feel like a genuine boundary between outside and inside. She had created a sense of threshold and transition, so that moving from the harsh outside world into the warm interior of the cave felt like a genuine entry into a place of safety and rest. The materials of the cave itself, the smoothness of stone worn by water over millennia, the way the light played across the surfaces, the fundamental silence and stability of rock that had existed before humans and would exist long after, created a sense of shelter that was almost spiritual in its completeness. It was in the midst of this work that she discovered the sack of flour. She had been down the path from the cave on a morning when mist clung to the ground and the temperature hovered just above freezing, and she had found it sitting at the base of the ridge, where the path widened into something approximating a road. The sack was large and heavy and wrapped in rough muslin, with her name written in careful script on a piece of paper pinned to the top. Not her married name, her given name, Elsa, which meant whoever had left it had known her before she became Thomas Brannock's wife. The discovery stopped her in her tracks. She stood for a long time holding the flower, her hands shaking slightly despite the cold, the weight of it substantial and real against her body. She looked down the path toward town, her eyes searching for some indication of who had brought it. But the morning was empty, except for the crows calling in the distance and a single column of smoke rising from one of the town's chimneys. The path showed no footprints. The frost had covered everything equally, and there was no trace of passage except the sack itself. She held the sack against her chest like a secret and carried it back up to the cave, moving carefully so as not to slip on the icy ground. The flour was of good quality, fine and white, and clearly not the roughest grade that would have been the cheapest option. Someone had taken trouble to bring this, and trouble to choose well. Elsa spread it across several crocks, sealing the lids tight against the damp, and set them on her shelves between the salt and the dried goods. The flour tripled the bread she could make, and she found herself baking more often, the repetitive work of kneading and shaping and waiting for rise, becoming something close to prayer. The rhythm of bread making was ancient and fundamental, the mixing of flour and water and salt, the slow fermentation that transformed simple ingredients into something greater than the sum of its parts, the careful shaping that gave the dough form and intention, the baking that completed the transformation and locked in the work of hours. She thought of Thomas sometimes when she was working with the flour. Thomas had loved bread, particularly the heavy dark loaves she had made before the troubles, before Harlan had begun circling like a vulture around the homestead. Thomas had had the kind of simple appetite for good food that made cooking feel like an act of love rather than obligation. She wondered what he would have thought of the cave, of her transformation into something both harder and more capable than the woman he had married. She wondered if he would have been proud or horrified, if he would have recognized her in this woman who moved through the world with such singular purpose and such fierce self-sufficiency. There was no way to know. Thomas was gone, and in his absence had created a space large enough for her to become someone entirely new. The grief of his loss had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something different, something that existed alongside her pride in her own capability rather than overwhelming it. She could hold both, the sadness of his absence and the strength that absence had forced her to develop. As November deepened, the town's mockery had grown more pointed and more vicious. Harlan had been making his pronouncements in the general store and the tavern, declaring for anyone who would listen that his sister-in-law had gone feral, that she was likely to starve or freeze or be taken by wolves before the winter was out. There was something hungry in the way he spoke about her suffering, some dark relish in the prediction of her demise. The men who listened to him laughed in the way that people laugh when they are being given permission to think cruel thoughts, and their laughter circled down from the tavern and the store, and through the streets of Sutter's Bend, like a kind of poison. The women in the town whispered when they saw each other at the market. Elsa's name was spoken with a mixture of pity and disapproval, pity for her obvious destitution, disapproval for her refusal to accept help or to return to the society that had rejected her. There was something threatening about her independence to people who had built their lives around dependence and cooperation within rigid social structures. Her choice to live outside those structures, to prove that she did not need them, challenged the fundamental assumptions that underlay their community. The children had begun to throw stones. Elsa was carrying water from the small spring near the cave entrance one morning when the first volley came, not aimed at her directly, but at the cave entrance, at the heavy canvas she had nailed across the opening as a windbreak. 3 stones struck the fabric, and she heard the children's voices raised in excitement and something like malice. She set down her water bucket and walked to the entrance, and the children scattered like birds, running back down the path toward town. They were young, the oldest perhaps 10, the youngest maybe 6. They carried sticks and wore the uniform dullness of children without imagination, repeating the cruelties of their parents like actors reciting lines they didn't fully understand. The stones had not broken anything. The canvas was tough and weathered, and the impact had made only a dull sound. Elsa could have shouted after them. She could have climbed down the path and reported them to their mothers. She could have done any number of things that might have seemed justified. Instead, she walked back to her cave, picked up her water bucket, and continued with her day. The stones didn't break anything. The canvas was tough and weathered. The insults of children were small things, inconsequential things in the face of the great work she was doing. She had learned something essential in her weeks of solitude, that the opinions of others were like wind, present and sometimes loud but ultimately incapable of changing the shape of stone. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but it did not touch her in any essential way. She was building something real, and that realness was its own justification. The only act of genuine kindness from the town came from Eudora Platt, the shopkeeper who had helped her obtain the initial clay and tools. Eudora was old. She must have been past 70, and she moved through the town with the careful economy of someone who had learned to conserve her strength and did not waste it on frivolous things. She came to the base of the path to the cave one afternoon in late October, climbing the shallow slope slowly and with obvious effort, carrying a smaller bundle than the flour sack had been. "These are the last of the good apples," Eudora said, her voice breathless from the climb, but her eyes bright with purpose. "They'll store if you keep them cool and separate. I thought of you when I packed them. Thought you might appreciate something to cut the monotony of hardtack and preserved vegetables come deep winter." Elsa had accepted the apples with gratitude and had offered the old woman a place by the hearth, a cup of the herbal tea she was learning to make from the plants she gathered. They had sat together in companionable silence for nearly an hour, neither of them feeling the need to fill the space between them with conversation. The fire crackled. The tea steamed from the cups. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the trees, but inside the cave, there was only warmth and the presence of 2 women who understood without words that life was difficult but not impossible, that hardship could be borne with dignity, that survival was not a guarantee but an achievement that required will and work. Before Eudora left, Elsa had packed several of her fresh loaves in a cloth and pressed them into the old woman's arms. "These are too good to keep," Eudora had said, but she had held them close against her chest as she made her way back down the path, moving slowly, but with the satisfaction of someone who had done something that mattered. Elsa never saw Eudora again after that day. The old woman had apparently suffered a small stroke in December, and by the time spring came again, word had reached the cave that she had passed away quietly in her sleep. Elsa had grieved this loss in the way she grieved all losses now, with acknowledgement and sadness, but without the paralyzing despair that had threatened to consume her in the early days after Thomas's death. Eudora had been kind when kindness was rare, and that kindness would remain part of Elsa's story, woven into the fabric of her survival. As late autumn settled definitively over Sutter's Bend, Elsa made her final preparations with the precision of someone who understands that the margin between survival and catastrophe is often measured in details. She had constructed a heavy curtain from a hide she had been given years ago, a deerskin, thick and supple, which she had soaked and stretched and finally fashioned into a barrier that could seal the cave entrance against the worst of the winter wind. She hung it from a wooden rod she had driven into the stone above the opening, and it draped nearly to the floor, creating an airlock of sorts that would help trap the heat from her hearth inside the cave while keeping the brutal cold of the outside world at a distance. The sleeping platform was her greatest triumph in terms of comfort and practicality. She had gathered straight saplings and constructed a frame that was elevated about 2 feet above the cave floor, ensuring that cold air could circulate beneath her sleeping body rather than radiating up through her mattress and draining her warmth into the stone. She had laid a base of split wood across the frame, creating a lattice that was firm but had some give to it, and then covered that with straw that she had gathered from the edges of the fields surrounding town. The straw was remarkably clean and dry, and it created a mattress that insulated her from the cold stone beneath while being flexible enough to conform to the shape of her body. She had sewn together blankets from various pieces of cloth and leather that she had accumulated, creating a makeshift quilt, weighted and warm. The work of sewing had been meditative, the needle moving in and out of the fabric with rhythmic precision, each stitch connecting pieces together into something unified and strong. The sleeping space was positioned close enough to the hearth that it would benefit from the radiated warmth while remaining far enough away that there was no danger of sparks or embers igniting the straw or cloth. She had calculated the distances carefully, understanding that many house fires began not in the hearth itself, but in bedding too close to heat. The wheat grinding took her the better part of 2 weeks, work that was simultaneously boring and deeply satisfying in its tangible results. She had purchased 5 pounds of hard wheat with the last of her money months ago, believing that she would eventually need flour and that learning to make it herself would be a necessary skill in case she found herself without access to purchased grain. She had found 2 stones of suitable weight and flatness at the stream, and she had spent hours every day crushing the wheat between them, developing a technique that minimized waste and created flour of reasonable consistency. Her hands ached by the end of each session. The repetitive motion of grinding created a deep soreness in her palms and wrists that stretched into her forearms, but the work was meditative and methodical, and it produced results that she could see accumulating in a cloth-lined crock. She would work in the afternoon light when the sun came through the cave entrance at an angle, creating patterns of illumination on the stone floor. The wheat would gradually transform from individual berries into a fine powder, the sound of stone on stone becoming the rhythm of her work. The flour she created was coarser than commercial flour, with occasional fragments of the wheat germ visible in its pale cream color, but it was flour nonetheless, functional and created by her own labor. By the second week of November, the cave had become something almost unrecognizable from its original state. It was a home, genuinely, completely, undeniably a home, in a way that Thomas's homestead had never quite been. The hearth radiated warmth and light into every corner of the space. The shelves held the evidence of her labor, jars and bundles and carefully organized provisions arranged with the care of a merchant displaying goods in a shop window. The wood was stacked high, enough to feed the fire through months of cold, the careful arrangement speaking of planning and foresight. The sleeping platform waited with its clean straw and warm blankets, a place of rest and recovery. The lantern hung ready to cast its light across the space when the darkness of winter settled in. The air itself smelled of home, smoke and bread and dried herbs and clean stone and something else, something fundamental that came from a place made with intention and care. She stood in the center of the cave one afternoon, shortly after she had placed the final piece of wood in the stacks, and she felt something shift in her chest. It was not quite happiness, and it was definitely not satisfaction. She had learned months ago that satisfaction was a trap, a way for the mind to relax at the moment when vigilance was most needed. But it was something like peace. It was the peace that comes from having done what needed to be done, from having faced a difficult task and completed it with care and precision and absolute honesty with herself about what was required. The first significant storm came in the second week of November, arriving with the kind of swift brutality that October storms often possessed. The morning had been clear and cool, the light bright and golden, but by afternoon, the sky had darkened into something ominous and gray. The wind had shifted from the south to the northwest, carrying the distinctive cold that meant snow was coming. Elsa had moved through the afternoon with quiet purpose, ensuring that everything was in its place, that the cave was sealed as thoroughly as possible, that all her stores were secure and dry. The snow began falling in the early evening, first in sparse, delicate flakes that drifted on the wind, and then, with increasing intensity, until the world beyond the cave entrance had become a gray blur of white. The wind rose to match the intensity of the snow, and Elsa could hear it screaming around the edges of the hide curtain, testing the strength of her construction, probing for weaknesses and finding none. She sat by the hearth with a cup of herbal tea and watched the storm rage outside while the interior of the cave remained warm and dry and safe. The storm raged for 3 days, the wind occasionally reaching a pitch so high it sounded almost like a voice, and the snow piling up in drifts against the cave entrance until the heavy hide curtain was nearly buried. On the second day of the storm, when the howling had reached its peak, Elsa had gone to the entrance and carefully dug away enough snow to ensure that her chimney was clear, understanding that a blocked chimney would fill her home with smoke and possibly carbon dioxide. The snow at the entrance was already approaching 2 feet deep, and the wind had packed it nearly to the consistency of ice. When the storm finally began to abate on the 4th day, Elsa ventured to the entrance and pushed the heavy hide curtain outward, feeling the resistance of snow as she did. The outside world had been transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The ridge had disappeared under a blanket of white that was punctuated only by the tips of the tallest trees and the rocks that had been too massive for the snow to completely cover. The town below had vanished entirely, replaced by an undulating landscape of white that gave no indication that human civilization existed at all. As the snow settled and cleared from the air, she could see the sky again, a pale blue that seemed almost impossible after days of gray. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the storm itself had passed, and in its wake came clear, crystalline days where the sound of cold itself seemed audible, a kind of stillness that made every noise, the crackle of her fire, the shifting of her supplies, her own breathing, seemed magnified and present. Elsa watched the preparations in the town from her position on the ridge, studying the visible evidence of how people were responding to the early storm. She could see smoke rising from chimneys and the visible evidence of concern and preparation, people moving frantically, loading firewood, making last-minute repairs to structures. She could read in the quality and quantity of the wood piles. She could see the likelihood of each family's comfort or suffering come the true winter. Some homes had substantial accumulations of wood. Others had almost nothing. The disparity was striking and sad. The worst storm of the season arrived with less warning than the first storm had provided. It came on the last day of November, though no one in town had predicted it with any certainty. The sky had been deceptively clear that morning, gray-white and cold, but not actively threatening. Elsa had gone about her business with her usual methodical attention, baking bread, checking her stores, feeding her fire. By afternoon, the wind had shifted and the snow had begun, and by evening, it was clear that this was no ordinary storm. This was the kind of event that people would reference for years afterward. The storm that defined a winter. The storm against which all other storms were measured. The snow did not fall so much as assault. It came sideways with the wind, driven with such force that it seemed almost solid. Elsa watched it from the mouth of her cave, sheltered behind the heavy hide curtain, watching the world disappear into white. The snow fell with such density that the town below became invisible within hours, a vague shape in the distance that could have been anything or nothing. The wind screamed across the hillside with a sound like something alive and angry, testing the strength of the hide curtain, probing for weaknesses, finding none. She fed her fire with methodical care, adding wood piece by piece, monitoring the smoke to ensure it was drafting properly up the chimney and out into the storm. She heated water for tea. She shaped dough for bread, letting it rise slowly in the warm air of the cave, then sliding the loaves into the clay oven, where they baked to a deep golden brown. The smell of fresh bread filled the cave, mixing with the scent of the fire, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously ancient and completely real. Humans had been making bread for thousands of years, and here she was, making it still, in the exact same way, with the same basic ingredients and the same fundamental care. Over the following days and weeks, as the storm raged and Elsa sat warm in her cave, the details of the suffering in Sutter's Bend accumulated slowly through observation and the occasional visitor in the days after the storm passed. The cold was extraordinary. The wind drove the snow through every crack in every structure, piling it against walls and doors and windows with relentless force. The temperature dropped and dropped, past 20 below, past 30 below, settling at a level that made exposed flesh freeze in minutes and exposed lungs burn with each breath. The buildings of Sutter's Bend had not been designed for this level of cold. Most had been hastily constructed, meant to be functional rather than warm. The gaps in the walls that had seemed tolerable during fall revealed themselves as catastrophic liabilities once the storm arrived. Families huddled together in single rooms, burning whatever they could find for fuel. The cold was so intense that it penetrated even the best insulated structures, creating an environment where maintaining body warmth became a constant battle. In Harlan's fine house, the chimney developed a crack during the second day of the storm, and despite the expensive wood that had been delivered and the superior construction quality compared to most of the town, the cold began to penetrate. Harlan's wife and children moved away from the damaged hearth, and by the third day the family had abandoned the drawing room entirely, gathering instead in the kitchen where they could huddle near the stove. The beautiful house that Harlan had built with such pride became a liability rather than an asset, too large to heat, too drafty, too ambitious in its scope. The shopkeeper's building, which had been hastily weatherproofed with old cloth and canvas, lost a section of roof to the wind. The family that lived above the shop fled downstairs with their few possessions, and the snow that followed them down the stairs created drifts inside the structure that grew throughout the storm, accumulating in the aisles where goods had been displayed. They burned furniture for heat, the wooden shelves that had held goods, the wooden frames of old furniture, even floorboards in the most desperate moments. The smoke from burning wood and varnish and leather upholstery filled the shop, and the family huddled coughing in the kitchen, watching their livelihood disappear into flames. The schoolhouse had not been used since autumn, and its hearth sat cold and empty. The preacher's wife had suggested that families gather there for mutual warmth and shared fuel, but the suggestion had come too late, and by the time anyone thought to organize such a thing, the storm had become too violent for anyone to venture out safely. People huddled in their individual homes, isolated and suffering, unable to help each other, unable to imagine that anyone else could possibly be in as much danger as they were. The livestock were the first to die, and their deaths were silent and swift. The cattle in the barn on the edge of town froze where they stood, their bodies gradually becoming indistinguishable from the snowdrifts around them. The horses fared better, their natural insulation more effective, but eventually the cold reached them too, and several of the town's most valuable animals lay down in the snow and simply stopped rising. A milk cow that had provided for the Miller family simply did not wake up one morning. The animals' deaths came almost as relief. The reduced feed burden was welcome, even as the loss of their services became acutely painful. But the true measure of the storm was marked in human terms. Old Mrs. Hendricks, who lived alone at the end of Cottonwood Street, ran out of firewood on the fourth day. She had burned what she had carefully, trying to make it last, but eventually the last log was gone, and the cold began to seep into her bones with a persistence that no amount of blankets could counter. Her neighbors might have heard her calls for help, but the wind was so loud and everyone was so focused on their own survival that no one came. She was found after the storm had passed, frozen in her bed, her body so cold that they had to wait until she thawed slightly before they could move her for burial. 3 children in the Jackson family fell ill from the cold and the dampness. The snow had gotten inside their home despite their efforts to seal it, and the young ones developed fevers that their parents could not treat. The oldest, a girl of 7, survived. The 2 younger boys did not. Their deaths were quiet affairs, marked by the absence of warmth and the presence of a cold so extreme that it seemed almost alive, a separate entity with its own intentions. The parents held their dying children, and there was nothing to be done but to bear witness to the process and to understand that survival was not guaranteed, that some lives would be lost, and that grief would have to wait until spring. The psychological impact of the storm was in many ways more devastating than the physical dangers. Day after day of wind and cold and snow created a kind of despair, a sense that the weather would never pass, that the world had returned to some primitive state where human survival was not guaranteed. The darkness of perpetually overcast days combined with the absolute cold created a depression that people would later describe as almost crushing. There was no hope visible, no indication that the storm would end, no sense that spring would ever come again. The wind created a kind of psychological assault. It never ceased. For 6 days, the wind screamed continuously, testing the strength of structures, draining body heat even from people sheltered indoors. The sound of it became maddening, a constant assault on the senses that made sleep nearly impossible. Many people developed a kind of haunted look during those 6 days, their eyes shifting to windows and doors in the instinctive hope of some reprieve that never came. And through it all, Elsa's cave remained warm and dry and safe. She did not think about the town. She had stopped thinking about Harlan and his predictions and his hatred. She had moved beyond the reach of the mockery and the cruelty. She was sufficient unto herself, not in a callous way, but in a way that was actually present and aware of its own completeness. On the 4th day of the storm, when the cold had reached its absolute nadir, when the wind had reached a pitch that made any sound other than the wind itself seem trivial and unreal, Elsa sat beside her hearth with a cup of herbal tea sweetened with honey and a thick slice of bread spread with the last of the butter she had managed to preserve, and she simply existed in her space of warmth and light and safety. The bread was extraordinary. Months of practice and learning had elevated her technique beyond the merely adequate. The wood continued to diminish, but was still abundant. The water that dripped from somewhere in the depths of the cave continued to be available. She was not in any danger. She was not in any real distress. She was comfortable. The storm raged for 6 days before it finally began to show signs of abating. The 7th day saw the snow stop falling, though the wind continued to blow with relentless force, and the 8th day dawned clear and brutally beautiful. The sky was a pale blue that seemed almost impossible after days of gray, and it stretched from horizon to horizon with the kind of clarity that only extreme cold could provide. The temperature was still far below zero, brutally so, but the storm itself had passed. Elsa emerged from her cave to find the world transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The snow had drifted into fantastic shapes, some of them a man's height or more. The landscape had been rendered monochromatic, white on white on white, with only the charcoal smoke rising from the few chimneys in the town below to break the uniformity. She could count the chimneys with smoke rising from them. There were perhaps 6, possibly 7. She counted others that produced no smoke at all, homes that had gone cold, structures that had no more heat to give. She stayed in the mouth of the cave, wrapped in her shawl, and she took in the transformed landscape with a sense of calm completion. The work was done. Winter had come, and she had met it with preparation and care and foresight, and she had survived it. More than survived, she had thrived. She was warm and safe and fed, and she had emerged from the storm with her supplies largely intact, and her faith in her own capability confirmed beyond any doubt. The storm that had seemed designed to test her had instead validated her methods and proven that self-sufficiency was not merely possible, but practical. Over the following days and weeks, the details of the suffering in Sutter's Bend filtered up to her through the occasional visitor who climbed to her cave, needing directions, or asking for help, or simply seeking the presence of someone who had survived what so many had not. Word of her comfortable survival had spread. The woman on the ridge had lived through the worst storm in 40 years in complete safety. while people in town had died or suffered severe hardship. The irony was not lost on anyone, and the mockery gradually transformed into a kind of grudging respect. Eudora had survived. Elsa learned that much from a traveler who came through asking for directions to the cave. The old woman had huddled in her shop with her family, and they had managed to survive through careful use of resources, though they had suffered from cold and hunger. The Jackson children had died, both of them, which was a tragedy of such weight that when Elsa heard it, she had to sit down and breathe through the weight of it. The loss of those young lives to something as impersonal as cold and darkness felt like a kind of injustice that no amount of her own survival could balance. Mrs. Hendricks had frozen to death, her body found after the storm had passed, her death interpreted as either a sacrifice by some, those who believed she had simply surrendered to the inevitable, or a failure by others who thought she should have done more to preserve her life. Harlan's grand house had suffered severe damage, and his wife had taken the children to live with her sister in a town 50 miles away, unwilling to spend another winter in the primitive conditions that Sutter's Bend represented. The visitors to Elsa's cave were never hostile, and some of them were actively apologetic. A man came asking if she would bake bread for him to take back to town. He offered payment, which she refused, but she gave him 3 large loaves nonetheless, wrapped carefully in cloth. A woman came asking for her herbal remedies, swearing that they had healed her daughter of a lingering cough that had threatened to develop into pneumonia. An older man came simply to thank her, saying he had heard about how well she had managed, and he thought she should know that some people in town believed she had shown more sense than any of the rest of them. Word had begun to spread about the woman on the ridge, about how she had lived through the storm in comfort while the town suffered. But Elsa felt no satisfaction at this reversal. She did not gloat, did not lord her preparation over them, did not say, "I told you so," to anyone who visited. Instead, she simply offered what she could offer: bread and tea, and a warm place to sit by the fire for a few minutes. She was sufficient unto herself, and that sufficiency did not require validation from others or triumph over enemies. She had not prepared for the winter in order to prove something to Harlan or the town. She had prepared because survival mattered, and because she was capable, and because the work was worth doing for its own sake. As winter deepened into its most severe months, January and February, Elsa fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural, something that her body and mind had been waiting for all her life. The work of maintaining the cave occupied her days, tending the fire, managing her stores with careful attention, baking bread and processing food, grinding grain, maintaining her equipment. She read by the lantern light during the long evenings. She had managed to acquire a few books from visitors, and they became her companions during the long, dark hours. She made music by accident, the way the wind whistled through the cave entrance in different pitches, depending on the direction and intensity of the wind, the sound of the fire crackling and popping, the almost musical rhythm of water dripping somewhere in the depths of the cave where the temperature never changed and the seasons held no sway. And she thought about what she had built, not just the physical structure of the cave and its hearth and its stores, but the whole edifice of her survival. She had taken nothing, no help except the flour sack and the apples, no privilege, no advantage beyond what nature provided, and what her own hands could convert into usefulness. She had looked at the world as it was, and had responded with stubborn creativity and careful work. She had refused to be broken by circumstance or cruelty. She had built a life, and that life was real and valid and completely her own. The philosophical weight of this understanding grew as the winter progressed. There was something almost sacred in the realization that she needed nothing from the external world except raw materials and time. She could provide for herself completely. She could warm herself, feed herself, shelter herself, clothe herself. The civilization of Sutter's Bend, with all its structures and hierarchies and complicated social arrangements, had been revealed as a fragile thing, something that could crumble in the face of a sufficiently severe storm. But what she had built, a cave, a hearth, food stored in clay vessels, firewood stacked to the ceiling, this was not fragile. This could not be taken from her. She realized something fundamental about herself during the long winter nights, something that had perhaps been trying to emerge for years. She was not meant to be dependent on others. She was not meant to navigate the complicated social arrangements of towns or to try to maintain standing in a community that did not value her. She was meant for solitude and work and the direct relationship between effort and result that came from building something real with her own hands. The cave was not a refuge from the world. It was the revelation of who she actually was when everything else was stripped away. By late February, when the worst of the winter was finally beginning to show signs of release, the snow that had accumulated on the ridge above her cave had begun to settle slightly, compacting under its own weight. The temperatures had begun, in the most subtle and occasional way, to moderate. The difference was barely perceptible, a degree or two in the afternoon, sometimes even approaching 30 degrees when the sun was strong. But it was there, a promise, a suggestion that winter's grip was beginning to loosen. The world below was slowly recovering from the storm. Most of the families that had survived it were planning to leave in spring, seeking milder climates, or at least communities with better resources for surviving harsh winters. Harlan's wife had made it clear that she had no intention of returning. Word was that Harlan himself was considering selling what remained of his property and moving east, where the winters were less severe and the world was slightly more civilized. The town that had seemed so permanent and established just months ago was beginning to dissolve, its residents dispersing to other places that seemed more hospitable. Thomas's homestead remained unclaimed and uncared for. The house that Harlan had forced Thomas to build, the land that Thomas had worked, all of it lay empty and slowly returning to wild. Snow had covered the garden that Elsa had tended, and when spring came and the snow melted, there would be no one there to plant new seeds or tend the growth. Elsa did not hate it, or Harlan, or any of the circumstances that had driven her to the cave. She simply accepted them as the facts of her particular life, as something that had happened and could not be unhappened, and that had driven her towards something real and true. One morning in early March, when the light had finally begun to truly strengthen and the sun climbed higher in the sky with each passing day, Elsa stood in the entrance of her cave and looked out over the white landscape of the ridge and beyond it the town, and she felt the presence of spring in the air like a promise. The smoke from her chimney rose straight and steady in the windless morning, a thin column of gray against the pale blue of the sky. Behind her, in the cave, her stored bread sat in cloth wrappings, ready to sustain her through the remaining weeks of winter. Her firewood still reached toward the ceiling, enough to see her through if the worst returned, but likely not necessary. She thought about what she would do when spring fully came. There would be work, rebuilding the areas where the winter had caused damage, gathering new materials, expanding her preparations if she intended to make the cave her home beyond the first year. She thought about the garden she might plant on the south-facing slope just outside the cave, where the spring sun would reach and warm the earth. She could grow vegetables for storage, potatoes and squash and beans. She could build on the foundation of self-sufficiency she had created, deepening it and making it more complete. She thought about perhaps domesticating some of the wild plants she had been gathering, creating something more deliberate and reliable than simple foraging. She could construct better storage structures, learn to preserve food in new ways, expand her knowledge of the plants and animals that shared this ridge with her. She thought about the future, and it did not frighten her. It was possible, and it was hers to make or unmake as she chose. The bread she had baked that morning was cooling on a cloth spread across the wood of her sleeping platform. The clay oven had performed flawlessly all winter, and she had learned to work with it in the way that a craftsperson learns to work with a tool, understanding its quirks and strengths, knowing how to position the bread for even baking, how to manage the temperature with careful addition of fuel. She could feel the heat of the fire now, just beginning to cool as morning aged toward afternoon. The herbs hanging from the ceiling were nearly depleted. Soon she would need to go out and harvest new ones, find in the earliest greens that emerged from the soil as winter released its grip. Life had become something beautifully simple and beautifully real. There was the work, and the work was endless, but it was her work, and it produced results that were tangible and true. There was the loneliness, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt instead like clarity, a removal of all the noise that prevented a person from understanding what was actually necessary and what was merely decoration. She was no longer afraid of being alone. She had discovered that solitude was not the same as loneliness, that a person could be completely alone and still feel connected to something larger, to the cycles of seasons, to the fundamental processes of survival and growth, to the satisfaction that came from doing necessary work well. She had not been broken by what the world had done to her. She had not been hardened into something cruel or bitter. She had instead been polished by circumstance into something clearer and stronger, like a river stone that begins rough and becomes beautiful through the movement of water over years. She was sufficient unto herself, and in that sufficiency was a peace that transcended happiness or sadness or any of the emotions that had seemed so important when she lived in the world of other people. The cave would likely be her home for the rest of her life. Or perhaps one day she would move on to something else, some other place or circumstance that required building and maintaining. But wherever life took her, she carried with her now the knowledge of what she could do, what her own hands and mind and stubborn will could create from nothing. That knowledge was more valuable than any homestead or house, more secure than any marriage or social standing. It was the knowledge that she was capable of anything that required time and work and attention to detail. She was a woman who had learned to build warmth and shelter and sustenance from stone and earth in her own labor. She was sufficient unto herself. And in that sufficiency lay everything that mattered: safety, dignity, the quiet triumph of having taken nothing from others and having made something real from her own effort and care. If your own story has stirred something in you, consider walking alongside us for the stories still to come. There are always stories about those who build rather than destroy, who persist rather than surrender, who forge something real from the raw materials of circumstance and time. The spring would come, as springs always do, bringing with it new growth and new possibilities, and the knowledge that the cycle of seasons would continue year after year, as long as she was here to witness it. And she would be here, tending her fire, baking her bread, watching the smoke rise steady and true from the chimney she had built with her own hands, a signal to anyone who cared to see it that something real existed on the ridge above Sutter's Bend, something built from nothing, sustained by will and work, and the refusal to accept the narrative that others had tried to write for her. The lantern was steady, the fire burned, the bread was warm, and in the simple presence of these things, Elsa Brannick had found what most people spend their whole lives seeking, the knowledge that she was equal to the demands of her own existence, that she could meet the world as it was and respond with grace and strength and stubborn, beautiful competence. There was a profound wisdom in having been reduced to this simplicity, in having been stripped of everything except what truly mattered, and having discovered that what truly mattered was accessible to anyone willing to do the work. She had not become wealthy in any conventional sense. She possessed little that could be sold or traded, but she had become rich in the currency that actually sustained life: food, warmth, shelter, the knowledge that she could provide all three with her own hands. She had become an example of something that the world had largely forgotten, that human beings could be self-sustaining, that we did not need to be dependent on complex social arrangements or the approval of others to live well. And perhaps that was the truest gift of her exile on the ridge. It was not escape, though it had felt like escape at first. It was transformation. She had arrived at the cave broken and desperate, a woman whose marriage had been destroyed by greed, whose community had rejected her, whose future seemed impossibly bleak. She had emerged, transformed into something harder and truer, a woman who understood her own capacity, who had tested herself against the harshest conditions the world could offer and had not merely survived, but had thrived. The world below would continue its complications and dramas. But here, on the ridge, a woman tended a fire that she had built herself, baked bread from grain she had gathered, and lived in a cave she had transformed into a home. That simple fact was enough. It was everything. It was enough.